Good morning, U.S. history students. Today we're going to be doing Notes 2.3, our last set of notes for World War I. Notes 2.3, that is civil liberties in World War I. Your essential question: what impact did the war have on civil liberties in the United States? Remember, the war started in 1914, but the United States would remain neutral. President Wilson did not want to get us involved in World War I. It was a European conflict far away from the United States territory, and it wasn't our problem. But eventually it would become our problem because we would lose 128 American citizens when the British ship, the Lusitania, got blown up by the German U boats. So it actually was carrying some war materials, even though they claimed that it was an innocent passenger ship. There were 1,200 people that died on that ship, but it was also carrying war materials to England. We also had economic ties with Britain and France, so not only are we allies with them, but we have money invested in their countries as well, so we don't want to see them lose this war. Russia would withdraw from the war, and then Germany focused entirely on the Western Front. They were gaining an advantage by being able to fight a war just in one territory instead of splitting their army in two. So Russia is now out. Germany can focus solely on that Western Front, those trenches in France. So the Allies needed help. So in 1917, President Wilson goes to Congress, asks them to declare a war. He calls it the War to End All Wars, and Congress approves. The United States is officially in the war. How do we pay for a war? Well, World War I, we decided we were going to do that through Liberty bonds. So a Liberty bond is pretty much you giving money to the government, and they're going to pay you back later on with interest. So you can buy a bond, let's say you buy a bond for $100, and they're going to pay you back 10% interest. So that means you give the military, you give the government $100, and then once they pay you back, you get $110 back because you get that money back with interest. The War Industries Board started coordinating all of the food, so they coordinated prices, how much everything was going to cost, and production, what we were going to produce, what we were going to have available in stores, and what we were going to be sending over to Europe. The Food Administration asked people to conserve their food for soldiers. So as you can see here, food will win the war. So they were asking people to do things like meatless Tuesdays, wheatless Wednesdays, porkless Saturdays, conserving the amount of food that they were eating so that we would have more to send overseas. Women began working in factory. They were taking what was known as men's jobs at the time while the men were fighting over there in Europe. This also helped them pass the 19th Amendment, so help get women's suffrage passed. We also needed more people to work in our agricultural industry, so we started having a lot of workers come from Mexico. So Mexicans came and they helped work in agricultural jobs in the West. And then African Americans at the time started migrating to northern cities. They also worked in these war industries, but they were not coming specifically just for the jobs. They were actually being pushed out of the South. A lot of these major cities in the South were having a rise in the KKK at the time. So there was a large rise in terrorist actions such as lynchings that were happening over the course of the Wilson administration. So during this time, a lot of people were moving, African Americans were moving from the South to cities in the North like New York, Detroit, cities on the West Coast like San Francisco, Oakland, LA, to escape the terrorism of the KKK. So the United States troops went over to Europe and they started fighting on the Western Front. So in those trenches, that's where they went and helped out in 1918. So they were able to push Germany back. Remember, Germany had been fighting in this war for 4 years now. The United States was brand new. So I want to give you a little bit of a different picture of what World War One soldiers looked like. So I feel like the majority of the pictures we see about World War One soldiers are these white males that fought in the war because most of it is Western European males that are fighting in the war. But we actually had quite a diverse group of people fighting on our side as well. So African American soldiers volunteered and fought for the United States in Europe, even though they still weren't being treated equally as at home. Remember, they were facing terrorism in the South, but they were also facing the Jim Crow laws, segregation, all kinds of terrible conditions, and they still volunteered to go fight for our country. So we passed a series of laws during World War I known as the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act was passed in 1917, and this made it a crime to obstruct any military recruitment. So it also gave the Postmaster General, the person who's in charge of the Postal Service, to deny mailing privileges to any material he considered treasonous or harmful to the war effort. The Sedition Act in 1918 made it illegal to utter any abusive language about the government, the Constitution, the flag, the armed forces, or even the uniform of the Army or the Navy. So if you said anything negative about any of those things, if you said, "Oh, I don't like our flag, those colors don't go well together," you could be arrested. If you said, "I don't like the uniform of the military, that's a silly uniform, why does it have to be pressed so nicely?" You could be thrown in jail for that. So obviously, these are against our First Amendment rights. We have the First Amendment, which provides us the freedom of speech. So there would be some court cases against this. So case number one, we have Schneck versus the United States of America, the anti-draft circulars that were published in March of 1919. So this guy here, he published circulars, which he sent out in the mail, to draftees of the Army and the Navy. So these are young men that have been drafted into the war. The circular suggested that the draft was a monstrous wrong motivated by capitalism. He encouraged people to not submit to intimidation. He didn't want any violence. He advised only peaceful action, such as petitioning to repeal the draft. He didn't want young men to have to go off and fight in a war that they were not volunteering to fight in. He would be found guilty on all three counts. So he sent mailers to young men telling them to resist the draft, and he would be sent to jail for 10 years for each count. So that means 30 years for sending these in the mail. It was upheld by the Supreme Court, and it established the clear and present danger doctrine for the boundaries of our permissible speech, so what would be considered free speech. The next case, the United States versus Debs. This was for a speech that was given. This man, Eugene Debs, he was a socialist. He gave a speech urging people to work against the US war effort in 1918. He said, "It is the working class who fight all the battles, the working class who make the supreme sacrifices, the working class who freely shed their blood and furnish their corpses, have never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace. It is the ruling class that invariably do both." So for giving this speech, he was also found guilty. He was given a 10-year sentence in jail for making a speech against the draft, and he was disenfranchised for life. That means they took away his right to vote for the rest of his life. When the war was over, President Wilson rejected the Attorney General's recommendation for him to be released, even though he was 65 years old and he was in poor health. So in President Harding in 1921, he declared his sentence served, but he didn't give him a pardon. So after we were fighting in the war for about 6 months over there in Europe, the war would officially come to an end at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. So this would become known as Armistice Day. The 11th hour on the 11th day in the 11th month of 1918. Over the course of this war, we had over 100,000 Americans die. There's still a cemetery over there in France for our soldiers specifically. After the war was over, we had the Treaty of Versailles. So the Allies met at the Palace of Versailles, which you also probably learned about in world history, the Golden Palace that is right outside of the city of Paris. They met there to figure out how they were going to make peace. There was 32 countries total present, and the main four, the big four, were England, Italy, France, and the United States. Wilson gave his speech, as we talked about last time, the 14 points. He didn't want to punish Germany. The other allies did want to punish Germany, but he really just wanted a fair peace for everyone. He wanted everyone to be able to choose their own government. He wanted everyone to limit the amount of military that they had, establish a League of Nations where all the countries could come together and discuss their issues before resorting to violence. But France and England really wanted to blame Germany. So they did. The Treaty of Versailles ended up blaming Germany for the whole thing. Germany had to sign a war guilt clause claiming sole responsibility for the war. They had to pay war reparations to France. They had to pay a total of $33 billion to all the Allies. They could only have a standing army of 100,000 men, no navy, and no air force. They had to sacrifice some of the land that they had been fighting with France about over to France. This area known as the Rhineland over here, they had to give over to France. This would eventually become part of Germany again and would be West Germany after World War II is over. And fun fact, the Rhineland, this part of West Germany, is where I was born way back in 1988. So they were fighting over the Rhineland because there's a lot of coal in that area. So they wanted to have that rich coal region. So they decided they were going to give that area to France for 15 years. France was going to use the coal, rebuild their nation, and then after 15 years, the people in that region would be able to have a vote, and they would get to decide if they want to be part of France or part of Germany. But eventually, we would have that time frame go by, and Germany would end up just taking that territory back under the leadership of their new chancellor, Adolf Hitler. So all of the colonies that Germany had got during that scramble for Africa that you learned about last year, all of those colonies ended up going to France and Great Britain, and they were able to split them. And Germany had to sacrifice all of these things here. No more colonies, had to pay $33 billion, no Air Force, no Navy. They can't buy or make any new weapons. They have to limit the size of their army, and they're blamed for the entire war. The Treaty of Versailles also established 9 new nations, so it shifted some of the borders. Austria-Hungary was broken up after that, so it became the new countries of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. And the League of Nations was created in 1919, so this international peacekeeping organization. It actually did not end up working, historically speaking, just because Germany and Russia were not allowed to join it. They end up becoming allies for the next World War that the world would get involved in, and the US never actually joined. Even though it was President Wilson's idea, Congress rejected the treaty and they decided that we were not going to get involved in any more conflicts that were happening in Europe. So although there were 60 countries total that joined, the United States was not one of them. Germany wasn't allowed to join, Russia wasn't allowed to join. And they had no way to actually enforce any of the decisions that they made. So it didn't actually make Europe this nice, friendly place where they would come together and talk about things. And in fact, another war would break out in just about 20 years with the same opponents. So that is the end of your notes for today. So don't forget to write a summary, a couple sentences about what you learned.